The following video contains real war stories. It contains graphic descriptions and mature language. The views and opinions expressed within do not represent the ones held by Interpo's finest. Viewer discretion is advised.
Although it only lasted about 8 months, we still see the results of this event to this day, as it witnessed a conflict between a young nation with enormous industrial potential and a well-organized political organization that was previously struggling with eternal conflicts, from civil wars to indigenous rebellions against its rule and the prevalence of gang activities in its Wild West, and a crumbling empire struggling to survive in this new world that had become alien to what it had known in the past, after it had contributed to its discovery, colonizing large parts of it and imposing its will on it for centuries. This event also opened the appetite of the United States for expansion and gave huge confidence to American politicians aspiring for more influence in the world, but especially in the American continent, who claimed and still claim that they are the only ones in the world who have the right to control its affairs, based on the Monroe Doctrine, which states that America is for the Americans. On the other hand, the Cuban rebellion against the Spanish rule, which was one of the reasons for the start of this war, gave a strong dose of courage to other movements and people that were unhappy under the rule of the Madrid government to take their independence by arms, such as the Moroccan Rif and the Philippines. Welcome to the Spanish-American War of 1898. Just a reminder, since the overthrow of Muslim rule in Andalusia in 1492, Spain was considered the most powerful empire in the world alongside the Ottomans. In partnership with Portugal, it controlled significant parts of the world, particularly in the Americas, where it maintained control over most of its lands for several centuries. However, by the 19th century, Spanish influence began to wane for three main reasons. Firstly, Spain fought a fierce war against the French invasion of the Iberian Peninsula from 1807 to 1814. Secondly, rebel movements, many of which were armed, emerged in the Americas and the Philippines, demanding independence from the land of the Matador. Lastly, internal conflicts over power, known as the Carlist Wars, weakened the royal government. These circumstances led to dire consequences for Spain, as the government became unable to maintain its influence, especially as its debts increased. Consequently, Spain was forced to abandon many of its colonies in South and North America. In Central America, Cuban revolutionaries organized several armed rebellions against Spanish rule in their country, as they fought the 10 Years' War and the Little War in order to gain independence, but unfortunately for them, they failed to achieve it in both wars. However, they did not despair, and with the leadership of Cuban intellectuals exiled in the United States, plus an unofficial American support, they waged a third war in 1895 called the Necessary War, or the Cuban War of Independence, through the declaration of the Manifesto of Monte Cristi. All this took place under the eyes of America, which was seeking to expel Spanish rule from Central America for its own reasons, which we will discuss in few seconds. It is worth noting that in 1896, a rebellion occurred in the Spanish colony of the Philippines against Spanish rule, led by the KKK group, which sought independence from Madrid. This event is known nowadays as the Philippine Revolution. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was established in the United States, named after President James Monroe. This doctrine stated that America would not tolerate any European or foreign presence in the Americas, and asserted that only the United States had the right to control the region. In practice, enforcing this doctrine was challenging for the American establishment due to their limited ability to expel traditional European powers, such as Britain, France, and Spain from the Western Hemisphere. However, by the end of the 19th century, after overcoming internal issues like the Civil War and crime in the American West, the United States had become a significant power that competed with European presence in the Americas and sought to overthrow it. The main reason for American involvement in Cuba was the Cuban independence movement, which received a weak and an unofficial support from the United States at first. Tensions escalated in the 1870s when Spain seized the Virginia ship that was carrying American and also British weapons and fighters for the Cuban rebels. This led to the arrest and execution of several American and British citizens, including the American captain of the ship, Joseph Fry, on charges of piracy. This incident sparked an outrage in the American and British public, especially with biased coverage in the New York Times and New York World newspapers. Under pressure from the public and the yellow press, the United States intervened with Britain to resolve the crisis diplomatically. After difficult negotiations, the US and Spain reached a peaceful solution, with Spain agreeing to release the surviving American passengers and pay significant compensation to the US government for the executed prisoners. In the late 1890s, the American yellow press exploited the extreme violence committed by the Spanish army against Cuban revolutionaries to fuel public demand for intervention, while the American political and industrial communities were reluctant to interfere due to economic concerns, as many American companies had large investments in Cuba. The USS Maine was an American warship built between 1886 and 1888, and it entered service in 1895. In 1898, the ship was sent to Cuba by the American leadership to protect American interests during the war and to rescue American citizens stranded there. It arrived in the Cuban capital Havana on January 25, 1898. However, on February 15th, an explosion occurred inside the ship while it was docked in the port of Havana, killing around 261 people on board, and about 94 others miraculously survived. Immediate investigations were launched to determine the cause of the explosion. A dispute arose between those who believed that the explosion was caused by a fire inside the coal bunkers and those who claimed that the ship hit a mine planted by the Spanish. The American yellow press exaggerated the incident and published false reports about its causes and the number of victims, inciting public opinion within the United States to put pressure on the president and Congress to declare war against Spain. As we mentioned earlier, the political elite, led by McKinley, were not enthusiastic about war despite their desire to expel the Spanish presence in Central America. The business elite, led by the major heads of corporations on Wall Street, shared the same view as the political elite in Washington and preferred peace to military intervention. They feared the fall of their company's stocks, which consequently leads profits to decline in case of a loss. Although investigations did not provide convincing answers to the cause of the incident, the pressure of public opinion on the ruling leadership was immense. The public demanded the restoration of the American nation's honor after the explosion and held Spain responsible for the events in the port of Havana. U.S. President William McKinley succumbed to the pressure and on April 20, 1898, sent with the approval of Congress an ultimatum demanding a Spanish withdrawal from Cuban territory. The Spanish responded the next day by severing diplomatic relations with the United States. Hours later, America announced the imposition of a naval blockade on Cuba. 2 days later, on April 23rd, Spain declared war on the United States, and on April 25th, the American authorities responded reciprocally by declaring war on Spain. America entered the war on April 25, 1898, by imposing a blockade on the ports of Matanzas in Cuba. It is important to note that the war had two main fronts, the Caribbean front in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and the Pacific front in the Philippines and Guam Island. The Americans entered the war slowly and did not mobilize all their resources for the war effort, due to the American political leadership's preference for a diplomatic solution over a military one, and its adherence to the idea that it was possible to find a peaceful solution that would spare the American nation significant losses. Most of the battles during this period took place at sea. as the U.S. Navy achieved a decisive victory over its Spanish counterpart near the coast of Manila on May 1st, significantly destroying Spain's naval prestige. In the Caribbean front, the United States focused on imposing a naval blockade to exert pressure on Spain, resulting in engagements near Cardenas and Cienfuegos between May 8th and 11th. Although the Spanish Navy managed to temporarily lift the blockade, the United States bombarded the coast of San Juan in Puerto Rico, besieging the city for several weeks, and on May 25th, American forces under the command of General Thomas Anderson was sent from the port of San Francisco to invade the Philippines. Additionally, on May 31st, the U.S. Fifth Army was dispatched from the port of Tampa, Florida, to conduct a naval landing near the city of Santiago de Cuba. The United States escalated its aggression in the war after the McKinley administration realized that the government in Madrid had no intention of reaching any settlement to the conflict. Consequently, America began to fight alongside the Cuban revolutionaries and cooperated with them in many battles, leveraging their ferocity, determination for liberation, and knowledge of the Cuban terrain. On June 6th, American forces engaged in a fierce battle in Guantanamo Bay after landing by sea and successfully took control of the city on June 10, 1898. On June 21st, the United States achieved a significant victory in the Pacific Front by taking control of the Spanish island of Guam after the surrender of the island's governor, Juan Maria, to the U.S. Navy. These events damaged Spain's international reputation, and it felt the need to restore its prestige. However, after the Spanish forces received large amount of supplies, including equipment, provisions, and replacements for their losses, which relatively improved their situation, they successfully thwarted an attempt by the Americans to provide war supplies to Cuban revolutionaries near Manzanillo on June 30th. Additionally, they repelled an attack by the U.S. Navy on Spanish warships in Trinidad on the same day. The main goal of the American forces in the Caribbean front was to capture Santiago de Cuba, as it was the location with the highest concentration of separatist revolutionaries in Cuba. A few days earlier, the United States had engaged in fierce battles on the outskirts of Santiago with the assistance of the revolutionaries, specifically in the village of El Cani and the hills of San Juan. Despite achieving victory in both areas, the United States suffered heavy losses, estimated at more than 2,400 between dead and wounded. The destruction of the Spanish fleet off the coast of the city and the capture of its suburbs provided the perfect opportunity to impose a complete siege on Santiago, and this is exactly what happened. On July 3, 1898, the commanders of the U.S. Fifth Army, Generals Shafter and Miles, decided to entirely besiege the city in order to break the will to fight among the Spanish soldiers. The siege was horrific and terrifying for the Spanish, as the American forces cut off all lines of food, water, and ammunition to the Spanish forces. Also, they constantly pounded the Spanish with artillery from the San Juan Hills. Temporary truces were made in order to evacuate the civilians trapped inside Santiago, but after 10 days, things became unbearable for the Spaniards, and General Toral, the commander of the besieged Spanish forces, decided to surrender with 9,000 exhausted and starving soldiers on July 16th. One day later, on July 17th, the Americans drove all the enemy forces out of Santiago, and the city fell to the U.S. Fifth Army. The siege of Santiago was the last major military operation on the Cuban island. Following that, the American command shifted its focus to the two primary strongholds where Spain still held control, Puerto Rico and the Philippines. When the Spanish soldiers' supplies started to run out and were hit by deadly diseases related to the Caribbean environment, their determination to keep fighting decreased, as they were unable to fend off the intense attacks from American forces. Ground operations in Puerto Rico began on July 25th. Led by the U.S. Fifth Army, they executed a well-planned attack on the municipality of Yauco and captured it after a short battle, causing the tired Spanish army to retreat. Their commander, Puig, chose to flee the battlefield. The U.S. Army continued its winning streak on the Puerto Rico front between August 1st and 11th, taking one municipality after another, sometimes even without fighting. On August 13th, the United States fought the last two battles of the war, one at Asomante, Puerto Rico, and the other at Manila, Philippines, and achieved a sweeping victory in both, without the military leadership knowing that the McKinley administration had agreed the day before with the government of Madrid to a ceasefire and begin peace negotiations between the two countries. In 1898, the U.S. Congress passed the War Revenue Act, which placed taxes on several items, such as alcohol, tobacco, and tea, to fund war expenses. The act also permitted the U.S. Treasury to sell $200 million in war bonds with a 3% interest rate. Initially, there were concerns that the bonds might not be sold, but they were actually bought by more than 200,000 investors. In 1898, there was no draft in the United States. In fact, government recruiting offices turned away thousands of young men who volunteered to go to war. Many historians attribute the enthusiasm of many Americans to fight to the influence of the Yellow Press, which constantly incited war in its newspapers and articles as a way to seek revenge on the Spaniards. The United States was notable for its self-sufficiency, supported by a strong economy that allowed the country to finance itself without relying on external borrowing, even during the 1893 crisis. The nation's robust industrial base, particularly in defense and weapons manufacturing, freed it from the constraints and dependencies on other countries. American weapon manufacturers played a crucial role in the country's victory in the war due to the high quality of their products. The incredible military and economic capabilities of the United States did not stop the McKinley administration from accepting aid from friendly countries. But who were these countries, and why did they help? We will provide the answer shortly. The United Kingdom and Japan were the most prominent supporters of America during its war effort, as the UK provided military equipment while Japan offered diplomatic support. The UK's assistance was due to the special relationship between them and Uncle Sam, backed by the shared factors among the two nations such as language, race, and Protestantism, which strengthened their ties. Japan, led by its ruling political elite, specifically Emperor Meiji, supported America in hope of expelling which was, according to them, the Spanish menace from the Philippines and Guam, which are close to Japanese territory. Debt was the biggest contributor to the Spanish war expenses. Spain lacked significant domestic support during its conflict with America, as the Spanish people were wary of the Cuban wars that had commenced in the 1870s. Many citizens who participated in these wars either perished or suffered life-changing injuries, and upon their return, they told their stories about the horrors and brutality of the battles to their families. Additionally, Spain's military industry was not as advanced as its American counterpart due to the country's poor industrial development at that time. Despite claiming neutrality, Germany supported Spanish forces under the radar with military advisors and Mauser rifles, hoping that Spain would agree to sell its islands in the Pacific Ocean to the German Empire. After the signing of the Washington Protocol on August 12th, the diplomatic delegations of the two countries met in Paris under French mediation and led by the French ambassador to the United States, Jules Combon. It's important to note that the representative of the self-proclaimed First Republic of the Philippines, lawyer Felipe Agoncillo, was not allowed to participate in these peace talks. The negotiations started on October 1st, 1898, and for a month, they focused on the Cuban issue, Spain initially resisted taking responsibility for the Cuban debt, but eventually and bitterly agreed under pressure. Spain also agreed to relinquish its sovereignty over Cuba and to cede Puerto Rico, Guam, and all surrounding islands who were under Spanish administration to the United States. In regards to the Philippines, the government in Madrid strongly opposed giving it up and only agreed to cede the islands of Mindanao and Sulu. Despite having more leverage in the negotiations, the United States wanted to expedite the process. So, on November 21st, it proposed paying $20 million for the Philippines. 2 days later, Queen Maria Cristina of Spain accepted the American offer. On December 10, 1898, the two parties signed the final document of the Treaty of Paris. The treaty included Spain ceding Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. The treaty was set to enter into force on April 11, 1899. After winning the war, America became a powerful nation to be reckoned with, which is remarkable for a country that had not long ago been struggling to survive in the aftermath of a brutal civil war. Since its founding, the United States adopted a policy of non-intervention in international affairs, but after the war, it gradually began to modify its foreign policies and emerged onto the world stage. One prominent example for this argument was its support for Japan against Russia in the 1905 war. Spain's prestige and influence in the world declined after its loss to the United States, as it was no longer able to compete with the new powers that had recently taken over of the international arena, and with the increasing debt of the Spanish government and ceding important parts of its empire to America, Spain was forced to sell its other islands in the Pacific Ocean to the German Empire in 1899. Within Spain, many Spanish writers, philosophers, and thinkers called for a cultural, intellectual, and social renewal of the Spanish nation. These individuals were known as the Generation of '98. The United States occupied Cuba after taking control of the city of Santiago de Cuba in 1898. It officially granted independence to the Cuban people on May 20, 1902. In the Philippines, after the expulsion of the Spaniards, local revolutionaries who fought with the United States declared the First Philippine Republic, despite the continued American presence on the island. However, the United States did not recognize neither the Declaration of Independence written in June 1898 nor the declaration of the establishment of the Republic. This angered the Philippine Revolutionary Movement led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and it quickly declared war on the American presence, today called the Philippine-American War of 1899. The Americans, being in a position of strength during negotiations with the Spanish, gave them numerous opportunities to impose their own terms that aligned with their national interests. This leads us to the conclusion that possessing power in international relations is crucial and essential. This is due to the anarchic nature of international relations, where there is no higher authority above states to guarantee their survival and prosperity. Therefore, the best way for nations to ensure their survival is to only rely on themselves by possessing power. One of the reasons for the United States' victory over Spain was its self-sufficient economy, which freed it from external dependency, as it manufactured most of its used weapons in the war by its own hands.